Hello YouTube, I'd like to talk about change as it relates to religion, spirituality, mysticism, all these things that I talk about on a regular basis. The idea of change, or the ability to change, ties right into them in a way that I think a lot of people haven't thought about. On the first level, we can look at biological evolution. Now, of course, as soon as I said that, all the Christians watching the video immediately got turned off and probably down-thumbed it and left. That's because they don't believe in this force. But there's a peripheral evidence to biological evolution in the evolution of religion itself. And you can look at the principles behind the proposed biological evolution and look and see how they actually operate on Christianity, on any religion, especially the more radical fundamentalist sects. You can see the bottleneck effect, the founder effect, you can see just general natural selection, mutation. They all operate on religion at a very literal level. It's a very literal, easy-to-see process. Religions, because change is life, and to be the same and not be able to change is, in effect, death. Religions which do not change die out. They are replaced by other forms of themselves which did change. Schisms. A schism leads to two groups. One is severely traditionalist and dies out. It loses favor and stops existing. A new group which is willing to change to a greater degree thrives. It grows, it persists, maybe for centuries or millennia. There are groups around today, religious groups, that have persisted for that long. You can look, for instance, at the pagan religions. They've changed too. Of course, most of the old pagan religions are now becoming very real again. There are actual theistic practitioners of some of these old religious movements. But they've changed. They're not the same thing that they once were. There are some that are more authentic than others, but they've changed some of the linguistic usage. Obviously, if you're following Egyptian paganism, you probably don't speak Egyptian. You probably don't know how to speak Egyptian. You would carry on, translate it to English. Of course, there's a linguistic change there that people don't understand. When you change a language, when you translate ideas or words from one group to another, you change the meaning. Intrinsically, you have to change the meaning, because there are words in some cultures, or terms, or ideas. For instance, the Eskimos have multiple words for snow. There's no English translation for these words. We simply call it snow. We would have to add other words to it just to make sense out of it. We would say the Eskimos might have one word for snow which is made into an igloo. We would call it, a block of snow. They might have another word for snow which is thin and over a layer of ice that you're going to fall through if you try to go over that river. We wouldn't have a word to translate that to. And so when you see things like the Bible, or the Quran, or any of these other supposedly infallible texts, translated, especially with the Bible, which has been translated from at least 3 different language sources, and there are hundreds of translations of it, you've got a different meaning. I've pointed out in a previous video the word Elohim, which is used in Genesis for God created Adam and Eve, of course, in the book of Genesis, and God says, let them essentially be like God, in a way. When this appears in the book of Genesis, Elohim, the word for this God, let us make man in our image, is a very literal plural. The book is referring literally to plural deities, because the Jews were henotheistic. They took one God out of a pantheon to worship. They believed in other gods. They recognized that those other gods had participated. They merely chose one specific god to worship, so they used the plural. In all of the English translations, you still have that our image added in there. But they attempt to reconcile it with a singular God, which makes sense in the context of the New Testament, but in the Old Testament it's clear. The Jews were henotheistic. They believed literally that these pagan gods existed. But getting back to the idea of change, you can see how religion has evolved. Look at Christianity. There was once a progenitorial form of Christianity. 2,000 years ago. it existed. It was a Hermetic religion. It was a migrant religion. It was a religion that cast aside the idea of material wealth, of secular and religious authority. It didn't have a church, a physical church body. It didn't have priests. It was a communal living arrangement in many ways. These people were essentially primitive communists. They held things in trust, or they didn't have material possessions at all and went around begging. They felt that the power of God, and they were celibate too. They didn't have sex. They didn't have children. They felt that the power of God would sustain them, that their faith alone would sustain their life. They didn't need to have a house, or a job, or a family or anything. They simply lived in common. The Romans oppressed that original religion. You have all sorts of Roman-based and Judaist philosophers pumping their own ideas into the movement. The idea that Christians could have children didn't come about until 100 years later, after these first groups were formed. They were migrants. They were Hermetic. They lived in caves. The Gnostics and the Arian Christians, they lived in caves and had little sub-communities in the suburbs of large cities and didn't even associate with other groups except to go around begging and proselytizing. The Romans, of course, saw this as a threat. They said, well, if everyone lived like this, there would basically be no government. There would be no organized religion. There would be no philosophy. Nothing would exist. These people would go back to hunter-gatherers. Thankfully, though, there were some Christians who disagreed with this and put their own philosophy into it. Thus, Catholicism was born. Catholicism, and the Catholics right now are looking for their next supposedly infallible pope to be completely fallible but take that mantle anyway. They transmogrified this religion into something that it originally was not. Now, I'm not saying that this is a perversion. I'm not saying this is bad. It's neither good nor bad. It's neither corrupt nor divine. It's simply change. They changed the religion based on their own political and social beliefs, and they changed it into something that is now successful. Of course, there are over 1 billion Catholics in the world. You couldn't have had a large, successful, powerful religion out of this original Christian group because it didn't have any organization. It didn't have any material wealth. It had no political clout whatsoever. It simply existed alongside any existing culture and basically had a partially separate existence. So the fact that the Catholic Church, and the Catholics always say, ours is the largest and the original because we're right. No, yours is the largest and most successful Christian group because they were the ones that were willing to hoard wealth, who were willing to force their views on others by fire and sword. They were the ones that were willing to go to war for their beliefs and take over governments. They were the ones that had vast tracts of fertile land. They had their own military presence for a very long period of time. They held sway over basically all of the European governments that chose to endorse Catholicism for 1,000 years. The reason Catholicism is large is more the function of the fact that it changed into that form than because it's right. It's evolution. We see the Protestant movements, the larger Protestant movements that split off of Catholicism, the Lutherans, the Baptists, the Calvinists, some of these fairly larger groups, they're successful. They're not successful because the Holy Spirit is leading them. They're not successful because they're right. They're successful because the way they've structured their religion on an almost evolutionary level works. It preserves them. But these groups have a problem. Right now the world is, due to technology primarily, the world is changing at a very rapid pace. A pace we haven't seen before on the face of the earth. For the last 2,000 years, things grew very slowly. It wasn't until about the time of the Industrial Revolution that we see it pick up significantly. Of course, life expectancy in the last 200 years has grown more than it did in the 2000 before that. And in the last 20 years, it's gone exponential. I don't personally believe that most religions that you see today are capable of changing at that rapid a rate. People's opinions once were local. People used to have to send paper mail in order to communicate with anyone at a great distance. It might take them a week to cross the ocean, or 2 weeks, or a month. It would take a week for their mail to get to their destination. They didn't have planes. They didn't have, powerful locomotives. They had steam trains. They had the Pony Express. They had wagons and walking on foot. Maybe a steamship. If you were really rich, you could afford to send your mail by steamship and it'd get there a few days quicker. They were still using mast and sail arrangements, wooden boats. They didn't even have steel-hulled ships. And religions, even then, were having some difficulties because you saw technology and society were evolving at a rate that outstripped religion, because religion is intrinsically, most mainstream religions are intrinsically traditionalist. They are opposed to change except when it's absolutely necessary. So I say this with fair accuracy. I think you'll see that the words I'm about to speak are right, and time in the next 50 to 100 years will see whether I'm right. I believe that most organized religions that exist today, primarily in the Western world, to a lesser extent the East, will not exist in 100 years. I predict that the Catholic Church will not exist in 100 years. I'm predicting this why? Because the Catholic Church is very dogmatic, very scriptural, very lawful, it's very organized. It's based on the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, of course, in the last few hundred years, why did it collapse? Partially because it wasn't able to change its ways. They were still building these massive stationary cities in a time when people became increasingly tribal and migrant. They continued with the technology, and you saw it with the Byzantines. They continued with that technology. They perfected it. They were masters at building walls. It didn't matter. Their foes just invented cannons and blew the walls to pieces. This is the problem. They didn't change. They were still using the same technology they had had for 1,000 years. That's why the Byzantines later got completely destroyed by the Ottoman Turks. Catholicism, like Islam, which will be less affected because in third world countries technology is not growing as rapidly. Catholicism, certain Protestant groups, these groups aren't capable of changing at the rate that technology in society is changing. It's advancing very, literally you can see it month by month. Used to be you could see major change from decade to decade. You'd say, wow, things have changed quite a bit in the last 10 years. We've got stoplights now. Then it was every couple of years or so you could see major change, like, wow, we just went from dial-up to broadband. This is incredible. Now it changes on a monthly basis. Facebook could collapse tomorrow and be completely replaced within 2 months by a totally different service. A service that hosts hundreds of millions of people could change overnight. That's how quickly it's moving. Religion doesn't do that. Religion is like bringing a catapult into Vietnam. Religion is like bringing a Sherman tank into 1990s Iraq. Religion is like being a Korean war soldier and trying to stand on a battleground in, 2040 against foes that are using laser weapons. It doesn't work that way. Religion is traditionalist. Religion is slow. Part of this is just due to its political structure, and you see this not in all organized religions, but a large number of them. I don't think they'll be able to exist in this world much longer. And this is, ironically, it fits in with the idea of Kali Yuga, it fits in with the end of spirituality, it fits in with the 2012 prophecy of the Mayans, the end of all religion, it fits in with Petrus Romanus and the coming of an age where the religion will collapse. People in the past weren't quite... I don't believe in these prophecies in a literal sense. Of course, I don't believe God told them this will happen, so you better write it down for people to be forewarned, which would be pointless anyway if it's fated to happen. I'm simply saying that people in the past were intelligent enough to know there would come a time when these religions wouldn't exist. Or, and here's what makes my prediction all that much more likely, or they will continue to exist in name, but in form, they will be radically different. It's an evolutionary process. We can say one bird and another bird. They're still both birds. They're kind of alike, but they look totally different. A vulture is not a songbird. They're still birds, though. They evolved perhaps from the same progenitor stock, but they took, over time to change. That's how they still exist, because they had to change in response to external stimuli. You're going to see the same thing with religion. If Catholicism continues to preclude its priests and nuns from marrying and having sex and having children, continues to cover up priest sex abuse, continues to not condone condoms in Africa, of all places, where there are countries where 20% of the population has AIDS. If they keep money laundering through their bank, which everybody, it's an open secret, knows that they do, if they keep electing the same old white dudes, they're not going to exist much longer. Rome will fall in the form of the Roman Church. There'll be a major schism, and you'll see the population crack in half into two much smaller groups. Or you'll see some pope get elected that takes a radical new direction and stops not condoning condoms and homosexuals, says, I don't care what you do. God doesn't care what you do. This is going to happen. They will change or they will cease to exist. They are not capable of maintaining themselves with their current teachings. I say the same thing about Islam. One of the reasons, now here's my final point, and it's about Islam. The Muslims claim that their religion's the fastest growing on earth. They're partially right. Actually, atheism and agnosticism is growing much more quickly. Paganism is growing much more quickly. But of the large theistic groups, yes, it's growing most quickly. Guess where it's primarily growing? In the Middle East and Africa. It's not growing in the Western world, other than you have some immigrants coming into parts of Western Europe for welfare, and occasionally they'll get a job. But you don't see it growing in the United States at a quick rate. Why? Because their beliefs are incompatible with our level of technology. Their beliefs are so obviously wrong, it's so obvious that their God doesn't exist and that their moral structure is completely corrupt, that people aren't willing to tolerate such a religion. They're not capable of converting the average American simply because the average American is either already completely spoken for by a different goofy religion, or they're too intelligent for religion. That's not to say I'm anti-spiritualist. There's no problem with spirituality. There's no problem with mysticism or occultism. There's even no problem with theism, as long as you don't use it to justify being a complete asshole. But these groups simply aren't capable of the rate of change necessary to exist in our modern world. Now you wait till you're old, and I'm presumably dead, and rewatch this video and see if I'm right. See if Catholicism still exists, or if it exists, if it's in anything like the form we know it in now. Fuck Facebook. Look at the rate of change. You can almost see it now. You can almost see Catholicism just barely beginning to change. You can already see some of the Catholics starting to demand that they elect a progressive pope. And even if they don't do it this time, by next time it'll just be like a festering sore waiting to be popped. And they'll rise up in the streets and they'll say, we're just going to leave the church if you don't do it. And you're going to see the same thing with Islam, because I've spoken with a lot of people from the Middle East, and you'd be surprised how many of them there are. There are a lot of atheists in the Middle East. I'd say 5 to 10% of their population doesn't even believe in Allah. Half of the rest of them, they pretend to be fundamentalists. They don't even give a crap. They come over here and they abandon Islam, because they understand that it's not true. They look at the misery around them. They look at the hypocrisy of the Saudi royal family, all their riches and pretending to care about the poor. They look at the Iranians and their constant warmongering, and you see the same thing with Jews too. Half the Jews in this country hate Israel. These people are giving up their religion. And it's partially a good thing and partially a bad thing. I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater and say all spirituality is terrible. There have been some instances where spirituality's done good things in this world. Not very many, but a few. But it would certainly be nice to get rid of all of these bigoted organizations. They can be reformed. I'm not saying that they won't necessarily reform. As I said, they may change. But they may just die out. So you wait and see. Wait and see in 50 to 100 years and watch this. See if Rome still has the Vatican. See if it's still there and hasn't been pilfered for, bricks to build other structures. See if they haven't put a giant theater there, or, a zoo or something like that. And say, it would be great if the St. Peter's Basilica, that big round part, that crescent, just turn it into a zoo. Have the cages on the outside, have a little park on the inside. You can have some zebras and giraffes and lions and elephants and shit. Maybe turn it into an aquarium. Have a giant glass dome filled with fish. It'd be more sensible. It'd serve a better purpose. But anyway, that's my prediction. I think that religion is going to die. I think you see the beginning of it now. People, you look online, you don't see much love for any religion. You see a few convert seekers and apologists and fanatics. They just get beaten down by a tidal wave of skeptics. No matter what, they can be in their own chat rooms, and the atheists just pour in like a horde. I find it amusing. Some people find it concerning, and of course, the religious folks think it's evidence of the end times. And it is, in a way. It's the end of religion, as prophesied by various people, as I'm predicting now, as anyone with a reasonable level of intelligence would understand is happening. You can see the decline of religion in the Western world. You can see the very beginnings of the decline in the East. And it's going to be wonderful and terrible at the same time. Peace out.